Today, we are thrilled to have with us three experts to talk about how COVID-19 has worsened the divide between rich and poor students in the nation's schools. One of our panelists calls it a disaster on top of a disaster. Our guests are Bryan Hancock, a partner at McKinsey and Company who has released reports, including one this week on the effect of COVID on learning this year. Julia Kaufman, who is a senior policy researcher for the RAND Corporation. She has used RAND's American Educator Panel to tap into what principals and teachers are seeing in the classroom. And Catherine Stevens is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, who will talk about how the decades-long effort to boost educational outcomes for low-income students has essentially gone nowhere. We'll hear from each of the panelists, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. You can raise your Zoom hand or put a question into the Q&A text function. And please tweet today at #NPFPoverty. So I want to thank all three of the panelists for joining us today. We're looking forward to having a good conversation and getting a lot of good questions from, I have some questions for you and questions from our viewers. So we're going to turn it first over to Bryan Hancock of McKinsey Company. Bryan, you have a new report out this week, and I'm sure you'll be talking about that. And I'm looking forward to hearing about that report as well as one you had earlier this year.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm excited to get into some of the details of what we learned in terms of what's happening with student learning during COVID. So this fall, we did a piece of research. We leveraged Curriculum Associates' iReady assessments, which they gave this fall, but also importantly, they gave in the fall of 2019, 2018, 2017, gave us the ability to compare where students were, in particular, K through 8 students, where they were at the start of the school year this year compared to prior years. And we thought that would give us a good sense of the types of learning loss that happened as a result of the school closures and move to remote learning last spring. So look forward to sharing with you that information, and then also what it highlights in terms of the disparities between what we're seeing in schools that are majority white, as well as what we're seeing in schools that are majority students of color. So if we look at the first page, the results are in. If you can fast forward one, the results are in. These charts show the difference in what we saw in achievement this year on the iReady assessments in reading and math compared to the historical average. And what we see is that in reading, students scored about 87% of where they did on a prior test, which represents about a month and a half behind, or a month and a half of learning loss compared to where they would otherwise be. But in math, the results are even more stark. They're at 67%. This is the K through 5 average, 67% of where they otherwise would have been, where they would have been historical years. And if you look at the difference between schools that are majority students of color versus schools that are majority whites, the differences widen. So white students in math are 1 to 3 months behind, and students of color in math, schools that are majority students of color, more 3 to 5 months behind. So these are the results. This is what we're seeing in terms of where students are. And in math, the learning loss accelerates the higher grades that you go. So we go to the next page. Okay, so we look at this, we're behind in math. What could be behind some of the differences between Black and Hispanic students and white students? Well, we tried to estimate the percentage of students receiving different kinds of instruction as the school year began this year. So in the spring, almost everybody was remote, but now we're looking forward and have some forward-looking projections as to what do we think is likely to happen going forward. So we're likely to see, and what we estimate seeing here is that about 50% of white students are in a pure remote setting, compared to about 70% of Black and Hispanic students. So more students of color are remote compared to white students. And if you look at the access of what you need to learn, so internet access, access to a device, a computer, that access has improved since the spring. And we know there have been a number of school systems, and we cite in our report, school systems that have offered Chromebooks, hotspots, other ways of providing better access to learning devices and to the internet. And we see that across all groups, the percentage of students that have access has gone up, but there is still a gap between students of color and white students. So if we go ahead, what we've now tried to do is say, okay, given what we know happened in a pure remote environment or a largely remote environment in the spring, and what we saw that playing through the fall, we're trying to project what's going to happen through the end of the year this year. And so if we assume the existing modality, so the existing mix of pure remote, the existence of hybrid learning, and in-person, and we play through those modalities with a mix of quality in terms of remote learning, what we think is that by the end of this year, on average, students will be 9 months behind in math compared to where they otherwise would have been, that being 7 to 8 months behind for white students or 11 to 12 months for student of color. But we do think that if there are improvements in learning, that can improve over the next several months. So on the next page, we estimate, well, what if in January, we're able to actually, we have the status quo, what's happened up until the start of the year, but then from January forward, we're able to see typical student growth. That would mean that by the end of the school year, on average, students would be 5 months behind in math, with that being 4 to 5 months for white students or 6 to 7 months for students of color. So we think this does make the case for both improving the quality of remote instruction to get that as close to in-person as possible. We know, based on the research, in-person is better. So also, as soon as it is safe to get students back to school, we do see that getting students back to school would help reduce the amount of learning loss. What we also think would be helpful, based on research and other examples, are some targeted interventions to help students catch up. Two of those interventions, which we have on the next slide, one of them is an acceleration academy. So this is based on some research that highlighted a school system in Lawrence, Massachusetts, that over the summer had an intensive week-long acceleration academy that significantly closed the gap for students that were behind, getting them up to level on reading in particular, but we think these acceleration academies can apply across reading and math. And then the second concept that we've seen work is high intensity tutoring. So this is where you have a teacher or paraprofessional or even a college student providing intensive tutoring, two-on-one environment where the students are able to ask questions, get the specialized help that they need. And we see that form of high intensity tutoring can also help get students back up. And we think these are a couple of the types of intervention investments that is worth thinking, both as we get back to school in the spring, after winter break, as well as in the summer, the types of interventions that can help recover some of that lost learning. So thank you for letting me share a high-level view of our research, and I look forward to the questions after a little bit.
Okay, well, we'll turn to Julie in just 1 second, but I have one quick question for you. Some of your top line findings were that the loss in math was greater than the loss in language or in writing.
Correct.
What are some of the reasons why that is? I mean, talk about how students learn in math and retain information in math. Why is there that difference?
I think, one of the things that we hypothesize is happening is in reading, if as an elementary student you continue reading at home, you can continue to progress and learn. Whereas in math, it does require the parent to be involved and to catch the mistakes. In math does require a little bit, it is more than just picking up the book and reading. It does require a bit more of the intervention. Also, the skills build on each other in a different way. And so those are some of the reasons why we think math is further behind than reading.
Yeah, and we also know that most parents don't know the math themselves, so it's tougher for us to teach their kids.
Totally.